Okay, well, good evening. Good evening to Oxfordshire Europe and to our supporters. It's my very great pleasure today to introduce Caroline Lucas. Before I do so, I'll say a few things about the housekeeping. The important thing to say is this meeting is being recorded and you will be on view if you leave your camera on. Just to say a couple of words about Oxfordshire Europe itself. We're a voluntary organisation. We're non-profit, not technically a charity, but certainly we believe our cause is a noble one, and we're part of the European movement. We're one of the local groups, and we have as our objective primarily to ensure that common sense prevails in relations with our other European friends, and that the UK's place is at the heart of Europe. And in the fullness of time, that it resumes that place properly and completely. Now, that's obviously an uphill battle. The European movement has recently had its AGM in Oxford, at which Caroline was a virtual speaker. And I think that has been a very enlightening experience for us and a very encouraging one, because we believe our cause is a good one. And to those of you who are here, I would say the meeting is free of charge, but we do happily accept donations, which will help us in our campaigns. So what can I say about Caroline? Well, this is one of the highlights of our year, being able to introduce her as our speaker. We've had a series of meetings like this, and I think this promises to be one of the best. Caroline is speaking in her capacity as co-president of the European movement. Actually, Dominic Grieve is the other co-president, and they've already got off to a flying start. I can say that she has got connections with Oxford. She was a councillor here in the County Council up to 1997. She worked as policy advisor for Oxfam, but you'll know her perhaps more in her role in the European and British Parliaments as a Green MEP, followed by an MP of great distinction, and somebody who has certainly made her mark in Parliament, having won the award of Parliamentarian of the Year on no less than 3 occasions. And she has also been perhaps the voice of the Green movement in the UK over many, many years, and no doubt many more years of doing the same to come. I should add that she is now has become a professor, about which you'll no doubt tell us a little more in a moment. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Caroline, and she will be telling us a little bit about herself and her work. Caroline, over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you to everyone for joining tonight and for giving me this opportunity to share some thoughts. In the preparation for this evening's meeting, we talked about what the focus should be, and the title we came up with was the UK, the EU and planetary health in the time of Trump, which probably sounds like a PhD thesis, or at least several theses. So I will give an overview, but of course we can go into more detail in the question and answer at the end. But I guess I wanted to start perhaps by talking about the threat to climate and nature policy from Donald Trump, because it is a huge and growing one. And of course, it doesn't stop at the US borders. It has huge impacts on the rest of the world, both directly, as we're seeing right now, for example, with the climate COP talks ongoing at the moment, and the US has withdrawn from them, but also indirectly as well, giving succor to other authoritarian populists who feel emboldened, I think, to threaten something similar in other parts of the world, including here in the UK. But what we've seen from Trump's presidency when it comes to environment and climate has been very much that he's taking a wrecking ball to environmental policies. We know about his climate denial, of course, and his famous mantra of drill, baby, drill. But we don't always hear about the full scale of his vandalism when it comes to the UK news. And so I just wanted to start with a quick overview of the impact of just some of Trump's actions in this year alone. So the US Environmental Protection Agency has announced it will undertake 31 major deregulation actions, marking what it calls the largest rollback of regulation in US history. I mean, it says that with pride. I think we should be looking at it with some degree of horror. The Environmental Protection Agency has also proposed repealing greenhouse gas emission standards for fossil fuel-fired power stations, reversing a key climate regulation. It has delayed stricter methane and emission controls for oil and natural gas operators. It's proposed rescinding the 2009 so-called endangerment finding that greenhouse gases pose a threat to human health, and that finding underpins all major US climate rules, and so getting rid of it will have a massive chilling effect going forward. The US Senate has voted to overturn a rule regulating 7 of the most toxic air pollutants, so that is a significant weakening of protections under the Clean Air Act. And of course, as we know, and as I've just mentioned, Trump also signed the executive order to withdraw from the Paris Agreement again. Federal agencies have been ordered to remove references to the climate crisis from their websites. Key climate information groups have had almost all of their staff fired. Science agencies have seen massive budget cuts and staff losses as well. And so essentially this all matters because with the US stepping back from climate and environmental leadership, the responsibility for driving global standards for diplomacy and ambition, I think, falls much more heavily on Europe, and the UK needs to be part of that. In global negotiations, fragmented positions weaken outcomes, and so we really do need to work together. Now, I think it's fair to say that we're used to thinking of the EU as a leader when it comes to climate and nature policy, as the obvious contender to step forward when the US steps back. But very sadly, recent evidence suggests that we can't be complacent about that because the EU is now itself facing its own pressures to weaken part of its climate and environmental agenda. So just last week, we saw the centre-right EPP join forces with far-right groups in a vote in the European Parliament to weaken key parts of the European Commission's Green Deal, this big, comprehensive, very positive set of policies for the environment. But basically, this vote in the European Parliament was basically to try to weaken some of those elements of the Green Deal by, for example, removing climate transition plan requirements, softening civil liability rules, limiting obligations to only the largest companies. The EU's long-term budget would scrap the 33-year-old LIFE programme. And you might remember LIFE is the EU's only funding programme exclusively dedicated to the environment and climate, and has been responsible for some fantastic work, including in the UK. And the EU is proposing now to fold it into 2 wider funds, but they have no guaranteed nature or climate financing within them. And the Commission has also proposed removing the current 10% biodiversity spending target, creating real uncertainty, I think, about how strongly nature will be prioritised in future EU spending. A bit of positive news as well, though. Last week, the Council authorised the Commission to open negotiations with the UK on linking our 2 emissions trading systems. And Member States also instructed the Commission to draw up a mandate by the end of the year for negotiations on UK participation in the EU's internal electricity market. I'll say a bit more about those in a moment, but those were 2 core asks from the European Movement report, which was launched a couple of months ago, calling for a new agenda for the UK-EU energy, climate and environmental cooperation. So that is very good news. But going forward, I think the real challenge when it comes to UK and EU relations is that we need to imagine it as being something more broad than simply about trade alone. I think, sorry, UK and EU cooperation on environment and climate is still viewed mainly through only a trade lens, and that needs to change. So, for example, if we look at the Trade and Cooperation Act, then Chapter 7 of that Act, the chapter on the environment, is far thinner than even the energy chapter, for example, with just 7 articles compared with 33, and almost no provisions for genuine cooperation. So what the European movement is calling for is a new approach based on much closer cooperation between the UK and the EU on energy, climate and environment. And that position was at the heart of a new report, and I hope you've seen this, a report that the European movement produced a couple of months ago. I feel very excited about it, having helped work on it with Simon Saunders, who's a brilliant staff member at EM UK. And we launched that report back in July. And on the platform with us were representatives of the Green Alliance, and the Green Alliance kind of acts as an umbrella body for all kinds of green and environment groups across the UK. We had Amber Rudd, the former Secretary of State, of course, for Energy and Climate Change, Energy UK, the voice of the energy industry, and a representative from the EU delegation to the UK. And the reason I give that bit of detail about who else was on the platform with us was that it felt really important to me that green groups recognise the role that the European movement can play in the field of environment, energy and climate. And it was one of my goals when I took on the role as co-president, was to really see if we could increase our profile and our visibility on the issue of the environment, both because it's so important in its own right. Of course, I would want us to do that, but also in terms of reaching more young people, reaching audiences that perhaps haven't recognized the links between our concerns around getting closer to Europe and environmental concerns, perhaps haven't realized that membership of the European movement would be one really positive way that they could support that kind of shift. So I just wanted to remind you about some of the top lines of this report, and of course it's on the internet, so you can see it there. But essentially, we recognise this as a moment of real opportunity and real urgency to act, because we now have annual UKE summits in place. We've had the first one this year, but they will from now on be annual summits. And with pressure mounting on Europe's climate and nature agenda, and with Trump rolling back on climate and nature commitments, as I say, it feels like renewed cooperation between the UK and the EU has never been more important. And what feels important to me here is that actually the UK could help those forces within the EU who want to resist the watering down of environmental action. And in a way, it's so refreshing to think that the UK doesn't always have to be in the position of demandeur when it comes to Europe. We don't always have to be the ones asking for something. We actually have something quite positive, I think, to offer to other EU member states, because as a member of the EU, the UK was often a leader, not a follower, on climate and environmental ambition. And again, we've been told how much UK ambition and expertise in environmental policy making in particular has been missed by our European colleagues. The European Commission itself has described the UK as one of the most influential member states in shaping EU environmental diplomacy. And as I know from my own experience of 11 years as a member of the European Parliament, we were often, very definitely, the most influential. And so we've got something we can offer on this agenda, I think. The second key point in the report was that a recognition that cooperation is the only route to planetary health. I mean, it's an obvious point, but nature and pollution and climate breakdown doesn't stop at Dover. And fragmented decision-making, frankly, is a luxury that the planet can't afford. And third, as I've mentioned, the UK's environmental leadership was itself built through European cooperation. The UK once shaped the EU's highest standards, and that leadership is recoverable, but only if the UK is back in the room. And fourth, the environmental costs of divergence are already present here in the UK. We're seeing more polluted rivers, relaxed pesticide limits, weaker alignment with EU air quality standards, and rising energy costs, all traced back to a degree of policy isolation. And finally, in the report, we make the case that the new partnership that we envisage is pragmatic, it's deliverable, and it's politically credible. It aligns with the government's mission to make the UK a clean energy superpower, and it mirrors existing EU partnerships with countries like Korea and Japan and Canada and Norway, and it also respects the government's domestic red lines. So in summary, the report sets out a practical and politically credible plan for rebuilding UK-EU cooperation on energy, climate, nature and environmental safety. And it argued that after the reset created by the first UK-EU summit just back in May, that the UK and the EU should establish this formal energy, climate and environment partnership. And we believe that that would provide structure, momentum and accountability. And it would be similar in that respect to the new security and defence partnership that's been set up and it would deliver real benefits for the natural world, for households and for businesses. The paper is rooted in that simple truth that shared environmental problems can't be solved with fragmented governance. And with climate ambition under strain across Europe and environmental standards slipping at home, the partnership is framed as a necessary route back to influence, to higher standards and lower long-term costs. And why this matters now, I think, as I said, that UK-EU summit back in May created the first genuine opening for deeper cooperation in climate and energy since the UK left the EU. Both sides signalled their willingness to work together. And with an agreement to hold these summits every year, there is a real opportunity to keep pushing for progress. And the European movement will be working to try to secure that at least some of the proposals that we're calling for in this report are taken up at future meetings. Now, I mentioned the cost of divergence, the fact that the UK isn't keeping up currently with EU environmental standards. And I just wanted to remind you about what that actually means in practice, because although there are a handful of areas where the UK has actively and positively diverged from EU policy, in other words, it's been more ambitious, and the government's decision to protect sand eels in the North Sea is one example, those instances are actually very rare. Sadly, for the most part, since leaving the EU, the UK has fallen behind on multiple fronts, sometimes to quite a significant degree. So on air quality, Europe will cut harmful air pollution much faster than the UK. They're going to reach safe levels by 2030. In England, for example, we're not due to get there until 2040. And actually Wales and Northern Ireland still have higher levels. On chemicals, the EU has brought in 13 new chemical restrictions and added 30 high-risk substances to its danger list. So in other words, the EU is really acting quite proactively when it comes to protecting human health and the environment from dangerous chemicals. But while they've added 13 new chemical restrictions and 38 high-risk substances, the UK has added absolutely none, 0. So we are falling behind on basic protections. When it comes to pesticides, the UK has weakened 115 safety limits on pesticide residues and still allows 12 pesticides that are banned in the EU, including 7 considered highly hazardous. And to take just one example of glyphosate, a probable human carcinogen, according to the World Health Organization, it's now found at levels 7.5 times higher, for example, in UK-grown beans than in ones that are grown in the EU. And then electricity costs. Electricity trading is slower and more fragmented and less efficient now than it was, because instead of participating in what's called the EU's integrated single day ahead coupling system, and don't ask me to give you a chapter and verse on it because I can't, I should be able to, but I can't. But anyway, this is a much more integrated system. The UK instead runs separate cross-border auctions, which is very inefficient. And basically it adds somewhere between 120 and 370 million pounds a year to bills. And the risk of further regression remains. You may well have heard about the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, for example. This is a bill that is currently going through the Lords, having been through the Commons. And it's been described by the government's own watchdog, the Office for Environmental Protection, as a regression in environmental law. I mean, frankly, I think they were putting it quite politely, because in its current form, that bill would drive a coach and horses through well-established nature and protection laws. And for anyone who'd like more detail about the divergence in UK and EU environmental policy, I just want to warmly recommend a recent report from the Institute for European Environmental Policy, IEEP, who've just produced a really in-depth investigation, and you can find it on their website. But what they notice, which is quite interesting, is that the UK has mainly diverged by default, as they put it. In other words, what's happened is we've mostly fallen behind in another number of areas and chosen not to keep pace, rather than deliberately rolling back existing protections. And perhaps there is a source of hope in that, because we can change what that default is and make alignment the new normal instead. So the report proposes essentially 4 pillars. 1, working together for climate safety and energy security, delivering the commitments in the UK-EU summit's common understanding, and that involves, as I mentioned earlier, linking the UK and EU emission trading systems. And one of the reasons that that matters, because it sounds like it's a very technical thing, but essentially the EU was about to charge what they call carbon border adjustment measures on imports into the EU coming from countries that don't have the same level of carbon tax as the EU does. And that could have cost us up to £800 million over the next 5 years. So if we link our emissions trading system to their emissions trading system, we can avoid those costs, and it's much more streamlined. We can also complement that with a UK variant of what's been called the EU Social Climate Fund, ensuring that the transition is fair and politically sustainable. And I think this is really, really important, because we know that energy costs are high, and anything that risks increasing energy prices, particularly for people on lower incomes, is bad in itself. Clearly, it shouldn't happen. But also it gives a lot of ammunition to people like Nigel Farage and Reform UK, who will then try and tell us that any kind of climate measures are top down, they're elitist, they're unnecessary, and that they're going to harm you. We have to make really sure that that's not the case. And if we had a variant of what they've done in the EU with this social climate fund, essentially it's a fund to cushion households from the transition, which might have some implications in terms of higher energy bills in the short term. And that fund is there to protect people from that. And to my mind, that feels incredibly important. Another point that we make is that the UK should move from being an observer to full membership of what's called the North Sea Energy Cooperation. And basically that means taking part in strategic planning that shapes shared offshore wind zones. At the moment, the UK is Europe's biggest offshore wind leader, and yet it's absent from the table where Europe's grid is being designed. So we need to be around that table. We need to align on environmental standards where it raises ambition, and I've already mentioned that, but to protect public health, to safeguard nature, to make sure we don't fall behind our continental neighbours, we should be matching, at the very least, EU environmental standards when they're higher, unless there's a very good reason not to do so. And finally, I think we should be rejoining some of the key agencies and programmes that the EU has. So you might remember the European Environment Agency, the EEA, which really does store and collect vital environmental data. And at the moment, we're locked out of that. And that means that we can't inform our policies with the latest data that's out there. And similarly with the European Chemicals Agency, again, we need access to that for safety data, for scientific oversight, and lower industry costs. And the crucial thing about those two agencies, the European Environment Agency and the European Chemicals Agency, is that non-EU countries like Norway, like Iceland, Ukraine, and Switzerland already participate in those agencies. And so there's no practical reason why the UK should not. And so, coming to an end, but looking ahead, we know that when it comes to environment and climate, the overall picture is becoming ever less predictable. Unfortunately, both the EU and UK are preoccupied right now with the sense of economic growth at all costs. And that has been translated into a sense that regulation is bad and that environmental protections block environmental growth. I don't know why Rachel Reeves has taken it into her head that bats and newts are the problem to everything. But essentially, as you know, she has now launched a battle with bats and newts and basically said that they are the thing that are stopping more housing being built, with very little evidence to support such a thing. In reality, so much of our economic well-being is dependent on a thriving natural environment. And it does take, I think, a particular kind of myopia not to see that there's no growth on a dead planet. Moreover, the rise of far-right parties in the EU, who generally take an anti-green approach, is having an effect. And I gave some examples at the beginning of my comments about how, for example, the refusal to pass a Commission proposal for a regulation on pesticide use was a direct result of that kind of muscle flexing that's going on out there. So I started by saying that the impact of Trump isn't limited to the borders of the US, and that the spread of the populist hard right is happening right across Europe, across the world. I mean, It's challenging for power, or it's entrenching itself in office, from the US to Argentina, from Italy to Indonesia, from Hungary to, yes, here in Britain as well. And it's now no longer unimaginable that Nigel Farage could become Prime Minister of the UK, and his views on climate and nature are sadly all too well known. Everywhere the populist right is gaining power, it is rolling back climate and environmental policy. And if Reform UK gain a majority here, that would also be the case in the UK. At the same time, planetary collapse creates exactly the conditions in which the politics of far-right populism thrive. In other words, chaos and fear and division. And so in many respects, tackling climate and nature breakdown and challenging populism are the same battle, because bold climate action can be the best way to neutralize the populist threat and expose its fallacies and flaws. In other words, if it's to be successful and sustainable, action on climate and nature requires precisely the nationwide investment, democratic renewal, and community resilience, which are also the strongest antidotes to the economic hardship and insecurity and inequality that fuel the populist right. So that is why I think it is so important that we work more closely with our European neighbours, because if we are serious about our environmental responsibilities, our place in Europe, and the well-being of future generations, then cooperation is not, I would argue, optional. I think it is absolutely essential. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Caroline. And superbly laid out defence of common sense and a view of the future that we all share. And I love the way that you link the environment to the other #1 cause, which is obviously relations with Europe. At this point, I'll say that we're open to questions. We've had quite a lot come in already via registration, but also on the chat group. Now, if you have a question, please do post it in the chat group and we'll see it, but please precede it with the word question so that we know that that's what it is. I think it's perhaps timely now that we have seen in many ways Labour colluding with the kind of environmental damage that their predecessors engaged in. It's timely to look at the Green Party as perhaps the one of the salient defenders of progressive values. And I think perhaps in terms of national parties, it's just, you may agree or disagree with me, very much on the left, and it speaks for people with left-leaning values. And rising from that, I want to ask a question that was put in by Paul Bowers, which is, how do the left make themselves heard and indeed relevant to voters in a world where simple answers to complex problems propagated by the far right and the media are more seductive than the truth?
It's a very good question. And I think part of it has to come down to telling more compelling stories about in the case for the European movement, about why our relationship with the EU is so important, and not relying quite so much on data and facts. And that might sound controversial, don't get me wrong. I think data and facts can be hugely important. But we saw during the Brexit referendum really how the Leave campaign was very well able to motivate people by telling a story. I mean, a story that, as it happened, was totally untrue, but that's beside the point. They were telling a story of, you know, of plucky little England sitting alone and how we've always done much better on our own, and if only we would get rid of the EU and the foreigners that come from it as well, we would somehow reclaim our glory again. And the Remain campaign countered that by kind of talking about the cost of the shopping in your supermarket trolley. And although it's certainly true that leaving the EU would indeed increase the cost of your supermarket trolley, it was a very transactional kind of response. It wasn't actually touching people's hearts. It wasn't a visceral sense of who we are as a nation. And so I think part of the answer to your question is about not being afraid to be a bit more passionate about it and to tell more compelling stories. So, for example, when the far right are kind of taking pictures of themselves by the white cliffs of Dover and claiming that, we managed to defend ourselves in the Battle of Britain and we can do it alone again, we might just point out that 1 in 10 RAF pilots during the Battle of Britain were actually refugees from occupied Europe. This myth that they tell of Britain at one point being, entirely isolated and on our own, and that's when we were great, is absolute rubbish.
And I think that fits very well into the context of your recent book. And thank you for that answer. So the next question really came from Peter Harbour, and question, I suppose, and you said this yourself earlier, that the UK and EU must collaborate on everything, especially trade, culture, and defence. Do you think that in the long term, rejoin is the best answer and a realistic one?
Well, we can have a big conversation, I suppose, as to what the long term is. But essentially, yes, I do. Clearly, I think that leaving the EU was an absolute disaster. And I would love to see us rejoin. I think there are certain conditions that would need to be in place before we could do that. And they're beginning to come into place. So one of those conditions would, of course, be that there would be a settled majority in this country who would be in favour of doing that. And we can see that more and more people now are acknowledging that leaving the EU was a terrible mistake. And that figure probably needs to get still higher, not least because I think if we were to start to ask the EU about rejoining, then they would want to know that we were serious and would not be hankering to leave again just a few years after that. So I think we've still got to do quite a lot to earn our right to request rejoining, if you like, and to demonstrate that we're serious about it. But it feels as if, the economy is doing part of our work for us, in the sense that, there are so many estimates now of just how much it's cost us to leave the EU. I mean, the figures around 4% of GDP and so on. Exports lost, businesses closed. And that reality is I think, really biting. I mean, Professor Tim Lang was on the radio at lunchtime talking about how, Brexit has also led to higher food prices as well. So I think there will be very practical reasons why more and more people will come to this view. I am happy to see that joining the customs union or the single market can be steps towards that, because I think that what will happen then is that people will say, well, why are we part of this single market if we don't actually have a voice around the table? And so it's more likely then to lead to a greater number of people saying, yes, we need that political voice as well. So my answer to you is yes. I definitely think that rejoining is inevitable, frankly, and practical. I'd be more hesitant if you were pushing me to put a time scale on it. I guess all I would say is that things can happen faster than we ever imagine. When we first left, I genuinely thought that it may or may not be in my lifetime. I would now think, it would certainly be in the next 10 to 15 years, let's put it that way.
Well, that's very promising. Thank you for that. And it was very, very good at the AGM of the European Movement in Oxford on Saturday to hear very similar tones from some of the speakers. And I think the pressure of events has really made a significant difference to how we see ourselves inside Europe. Question from Noah Atbani. What single environmental policy would have the most substantial impact in terms of reducing the adverse consequences of climate breakdown?
Well, probably leaving fossil fuels in the ground, I think. I mean, what I find so frustrating about Labour is that they don't seem to realise that the good things that they do have to replace the bad things that they do, not be in addition to it. And by that I mean, for example, you have someone like Ed Miliband, for whom I have a lot of respect, who will, wax lyrical about the amount of renewable energy that we're adding to the grid, and a very good thing too. But he doesn't seem to recognise, the government doesn't seem to recognise that renewable energy is meant to displace fossil fuel energy, not simply be added to it. And therefore, we need to see them absolutely rule out, for example, opening the Rosebank oil field, which would be the biggest undeveloped oil field in the North Sea. and that would create the same number of emissions as the 28 least developed countries put together. We need to see them stop their weasel words about saying, well, we might just let there be more oil and gas drilling if they're in fields adjacent to existing ones. You know, the climate doesn't give a fig about whether or not the emissions are coming from a field that is an adjacent one to another one, or if it's a brand new one. This is just kind of weasel words. So I think what we really need to do is to stop doing the bad stuff. And right now, burning fossil fuels is the bad stuff. I mean, having said all of that, I always struggle with these questions because it's really difficult to boil things down to one thing. And I'm also very aware of the amount of emissions that come from land use. And we certainly need to change the way that we use land and some of our farming techniques and so forth. But if we were looking for something that was quick and relatively easy, frankly, then it would be keeping fossil fuels in the ground. Because if the government would simply properly fund energy efficiency and properly fund, for example, a street-by-street comprehensive home insulation program, you know, it's been shown that that would save a huge amount of energy. And yet instead of doing that, they're actually talking about cutting what's known as the ECO, the Energy Company Obligation, which is one of the mechanisms that funds home insulation. So it makes absolutely no sense at all in terms of what the government is doing right now.
Thank you. A question here from Geraldine Coggins. So next June is going to be the 10th anniversary of the Brexit referendum. There's planned to be a national rejoin march that month. Will the European movement be working with the march organisers to ensure a big turnout and much publicity?
I'm afraid that is a question well above my pay grade. I don't know what the European movement is discussing about that, but I will certainly take it away and ask them. I genuinely don't know what plans they have. I'm sure they'll be marking it in some way, but in what way, I don't know.
I think a lot of us feel that this is going to be a fairly significant marker in the sense that people will increasingly ask themselves how much time has passed and how little benefit have we seen in the meantime.
I mean, I definitely think it's an absolutely pivotal moment to come out with a whole load of communications around that and to do something that is high profile and visible. I think, you know, if that march is to happen, we need to make sure it's a bloody big one, to be honest, because the worst thing to happen would be if there weren't very many people there. So I think we'd really need to know that that was going to be big. And maybe there's a question, or rather a point, about having quite a lot of smaller ones too in localities where we can be perhaps more certain that people will actually turn up, because constantly coming down to London, I know, can be quite a big deal for people, and it's all too easy to think, well, you know, maybe I won't go. Whereas if it's in your own locality, then it's perhaps a bit easier.
And I've often felt going on those marches how many people we passed by who would be in sympathy with us, and all they had to do was just leave the pavement, join the march,
Exactly.
and they would make an impact, whereas we've travelled for miles and miles to be there. So I've got a question from Colin Gordon. And I think this links to some extent to what you said earlier about the UK diverging from the EU in terms of environmental standards. But within the EU itself, do you think the EU is getting less green? And at what point is that going to start affecting the Greens' feelings about rejoin?
Well, I think self-evidently the EU is getting less green, and that is a result of more member states electing governments that are to the right, or even sadly in some cases the far right. And we can see what impact they're having by some of those examples that I gave of European Parliament votes that are now being far less ambitious than they would once have been. I mean, I remember the glorious days when I was a member of the European Parliament where, you know, there were moments when there were 5 or 6 environment ministers from Green parties who were really driving environmental policy forward. And that feels like that was quite a long time ago. But to the second part of the question, does that therefore mean that we shouldn't rejoin the EU? I suppose that comes back to what I was saying earlier about the fact that hopefully, notwithstanding the fact that we have diverged on some areas, hopefully the UK can still be a force for more ambitious policy making. And as long as we make sure that Farage does not become Prime Minister at the next election, then I think we can be fairly sure that we would be a positive force within the EU. And so part of it is about what role we can play as as a member of the EU to make sure that that bloc does get pushed in a greener direction. I think the idea that because it's not being as green as we would want, we would therefore turn against it and reinforce our own isolation would be, to compound our own problems, to be honest. I think we have a service to do to the rest, or with the rest of the EU, to try to add our voices to those common sense voices who are pointing out that there are very good economic reasons for taking the decisions that Europe is taking when it comes to environment and climate. And also make sure that we have, for example, like that climate social fund I mentioned, make sure that we do have real resources on the table to support some lower income neighbourhoods and communities to make the transition that's necessary.
Thank you. And I suppose to some extent linked to that, another question from Colin Gordon: how do you rate the performance of the Greens / EFA group in the European Parliament? And I want to link that, if I might, to a more general question that I had in my mind, which was, I'd be interested in knowing your thoughts on the Green Party's progress since you stood down from your role as their parliamentary spokesman.
Well, I feel better qualified to talk about the situation in the UK, to be honest, than I do about the Greens and EFA in the European Parliament, because I'm very sorry, but I just haven't had the time to be following very closely what they are doing. I mean, when it comes to the UK, obviously, when I stood down, then I was replaced by 4 Green MPs, which is quite a good calculation, and I think they're doing a fantastic job. Ellie Chowns is a member of the Environmental Audit Committee, and she's really been a very vocal champion for environment in particular. And just yesterday, for example, I noticed that she had an adjournment debate in the House of Commons around warm homes and trying to stop the government from rolling back home insulation and energy efficiency. So I think that our MPs are doing a really great job, and it's so fantastic to see that that they're able to cover so many more areas than I was on my own, because just literally you can't be in that many places simultaneously, whereas they can separate up the work between them to some extent and therefore cover a much wider agenda. I think the Greens in national politics right now, I mean, these are uncharted times for us, unprecedented times in terms of our membership, which is now more than doubled, nearly trebled, and in terms of the polling that we are now achieving, sort of 16 or 17% in some polls. What I would love to see, and what I think is so important, and I'm sorry if I sound like a broken record, but I am genuinely really, really worried about a Farage-led government at the next election. And what if I had one plea for Keir Starmer, it would be to use the majority that he has in Parliament right now to introduce proportional representation. That is our best hope for keeping out a reform-led government. And believe me, if we get a reform-led government, then so many of the issues that we care about, whether that's to do with the environment or climate or human rights or anything else, closeness to Europe, would just go up in smoke. Whereas we know, in a sense, he could claim he has a mandate for it, in the sense that a majority of Labour Party MPs have voted for it already at their party conference. The unions are in favour of it. When you get to a point where Nigel Farage stops saying he's in favour of PR and starts saying that he wants first past the post, you know that you're in very dangerous territory. And basically that happens when parties start to get about 29, 30% in the polls, then first past the post starts working for them. And so Farage could be Prime Minister on less than a third of the vote, which is a horrifying idea. So I think that what Keir Starmer should be doing over these next few years is really inoculating the British political system against that kind of outcome. And at the same time, while he's at it, as well as introducing proportional representation, I would love him to do things like put in rules to stop huge amounts of money coming from people like Elon Musk to fund parties like Reform. I mean, frankly, I don't care actually too much where the money's coming from and where it's going to, but it should not be buying influence in our political system. And again, that's something that Starmer could do now with that big majority, which he is frankly just frittering away at the minute. I think these are really dangerous times, and I hope there are voices within the Labour Party who will be making that case as well.
Thank you. I've got a further question here. this links to your recent book. Is it okay to not have a strong sense of national identity?
Is it okay not to have a strong sense of national identity? Well, I mean, of course it's okay. I'm not going to go around policing people and ask, how strong is your sense of national identity? And I also want people to feel that they don't have to choose between their European identity, their national identity, their local identity, and identity that they might have come from another country with, Bangladeshi identity or whatever. I think all of us have multiple identities. I think what does matter is when, if I can call it, I can't find the right word and I apologize, but the left, the progressives, whatever we want to call ourselves, the centre and left, when we vacate the territory of talking about England and Englishness, then what we do is we basically cede that argument and that territory to the far right. And that really worries me. So basically, I would argue that the right have hijacked Englishness. And for the right, the hard right, it's about exceptionalism, it's about imperial nostalgia, it's about, some kind of ethnic nationalism, it's divisive, it's anti-immigrant, it's intolerant. And that is not who England is. We've got a fantastic history of being something different. And for as long as the left is too scared to even have the conversation, for as long as we feel too squeamish to even be, on the territory talking about national identity, then we leave all of that ground really for the far right to use to their heart's content. So what I do think matters is that we should at least be having part of that conversation. We should be remembering some of the positive stories of England. And that doesn't mean airbrushing our imperial past. Clearly, as many have said, that unless we face up to that past, then we will never be able to work out who we are or who we want to be. But that doesn't mean being trapped at that in that kind of time warp either. It means also celebrating all of the amazing things that are going on in communities up and down the country, where local people are absolutely welcoming people from other countries, from other ethnicities, working together with them. There's a lot of positive stuff we can talk about, but for as long as we don't even dare to get into that conversation, then I think we just leave that whole territory for the far right to colonize, and that's very dangerous. If we leave it to them to decide who belongs in England and who doesn't, then the outcome will be pretty grave.
Thank you. And I suppose linking into that is the whole question which has been raised by a couple of people about cross-party collaboration. And Marcus Holside says, why is there no constructive dialogue across political divides in the UK? Now, I mean, I guess what he has in mind is cross-party working in Parliament, but I suppose many of us are concerned, I suppose, about the fact that the progressive side of politics is so divided. And, I think that certainly includes the Greens and Liberal Democrats. We'd like to think it still includes Labour. And what can be done to ensure better cross-party working to achieve common and shared aims?
Well, just to kind of say one bit where I disagree, I think in Parliament, actually, there is quite a lot of cross-party working. Certainly my experience of 14 years in the Parliament was that in Parliament, when you're there elected as MPs, there's a huge amount of cross-party work that goes on. And why wouldn't there be? I mean, as in my case, a single Green MP or the situation today with 4 Green MPs, they're not going to achieve anything if they don't work with others. And I think everybody recognises that. And there are some great examples on select committees or in all party groups where that kind of collaboration happens. Where it all falls down, of course, is when it comes to elections. I'm a great supporter of Compass, Neil Lawson's organisation, which exists to foster greater trust and cooperation among parties on the left, centre left. And I think we are going to need that. I mean, in years gone by, I was a very strong champion for progressive alliances as well. I wasn't universally loved in my own party as a result of that, because I think people felt that it was being interpreted as the Greens should stand down and to let anybody else, almost anybody else really, to fight the seat. And clearly it cannot mean that, and it didn't mean it then, and it certainly doesn't mean it now when we're in some polls even ahead of Labour. So there needs to be a recognition, I think, from the bigger parties that some kinds of conversations may well be needed before the next election, unless Keir Starmer gets his act together, introduces PR, and then we don't need to have all of these conversations because, in a sense, the voting system will itself throw up the coalitions that will then need to work together.
And I'm glad you mentioned that point, because one of the questions that came up is how can we persuade the party to take this on as being a desirable goal?
I don't know that I heard all of that, but I think you were saying how do we persuade Labour to adopt PR?
Yes.
And I think the best way to do it, frankly, is to put the figures in front of them and to show them that under most scenarios, they themselves will be better off as a result. You know, that might feel like it's a hard thing to say when they've got a majority of however many it is. But they are not going to have that majority at the next election. I don't think anybody in their wildest dreams thinks that they're going to have that kind of majority again. And therefore, you know, groups like Best for Britain, who do an awful lot of number crunching when it comes to different constituencies, have the data that would demonstrate that actually Labour is likely itself to do better under a PR system. And I think if we can make that case, I mean, I've kind of given up making the moral argument that all votes should be equal. That doesn't seem to have got enough traction. So maybe self-interest will work where moral persuasion hasn't.
Thank you. I had a question about grassroots from Susan Hartman. And I don't know if you're familiar with Grassroots for Europe, but the question is really whether Grassroots for Europe and European Movement can work together to make a difference. What are your thoughts about that?
Not.
Colin? Sorry, did Colin want to supplement, add a supplementary to that?
Thank you, Peter. I think what my colleague Susan actually meant to ask was about relations between grassroots groups, local grassroots groups, and the national organisations, and can we do more to make this a kind of a dynamic partnership?
I should add, Colin is Vice Chair of Grassroots for Europe. Susan, did you want to clarify that? What was it you wanted to ask?
Yes, it's just in general that how can everybody work together effectively on various elements, particularly coming up to the 10th anniversary of the referendum, when perhaps we're likely to be able to get more media coverage than we've normally get. And now may well be the time when we can put a bit more effort and get a bit more airtime and reach the ears of the people that just want to cover them over and don't tell me about Brexit. So any ideas that how we can all work together to go forward on that?
I'm sorry, I'm not very good on these kind of structural questions because I'm not really familiar enough with exactly how sort of grassroots European movement groups work with other European groups at a kind of at a local level. But it feels to me that in a way, trust is most likely to be built at a local level. So, and forgive me because I don't know enough about what's already underway, but the extent to which local European movement groups can be building those alliances, holding shared meetings, holding shared events locally, it feels like that is probably the most effective way of demonstrating the value of that kind of cooperation. I mean, I agree with you entirely that the last thing we need is, you know, a whole set of different uncoordinated events happening or initiatives happening where, in a sense, we end up diluting our impact rather than amplifying it. And I'll certainly take away the question and put it to Mike Goldsworthy and to Nick Harvey, because I don't, to be very honest, I don't know what they've got planned. But in the meantime, I would have thought one of the strongest ways of demonstrating the importance of the case that you're making is exactly to be able to point to local initiatives where groups have come together and there is trust, and that by joining together, your voice has been so much louder.
Well, thank you. And we're getting towards 8 o'clock, so I'm afraid it's only time for one more question. And what I wanted to ask you is, can you give us a note of hope? In other words, looking towards the future, what are the positives that you see? Are there any straws in the wind that are pointing towards a better future and some end to the doom and gloom in which we currently find ourselves?
Well, I mean, you know, there's the old saying, isn't it, that it's darkest just before the dawn, and it feels like in terms of our relationship with the EU, you know, things are getting pretty bad from an economic point of view. I saw somebody in the chat saying that the 4% economic damage now looks like a serious underestimate. And so, you know, it feels like that turning point where more people will recognize the error that it was is getting closer. And I think it is positive now, although I recognize that she's doing it for her own reasons. But I think it is positive that Rachel Reeves is now willing to point the finger at Brexit and say one of the reasons for our economic problems is because of Brexit. I mean, it's taken a hell of a long time before she's been willing to do it, but I'm very glad that she has. So I think when it comes to our relationships with Europe, that is a positive thing. And maybe, just maybe, it feels like, certainly within the different national organisations that I'm part of or that I know about, it feels like the horrendous prospect of a Nigel Farage government is also galvanising people to work together and to work more strategically and to recognise that unless we do that, then it will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so I think that in a kind of perverse way, it's precisely because things do look pretty grim that might just be the catalyst for working together in new and more ambitious ways.
Well, Caroline, thank you so much for that. And I have to say, it has been a really inspirational talk, as indeed is always the case when we hear you.
That's very kind. Thank you so much.
You have in the past, on 2 occasions, been leader of the Green Party, and I think it's fair to say that your leadership role continues. You're certainly a model to which other Green people of Green persuasion and people of progressive values look. And I think it's to a great extent down to you that the Green Party has now grown from 1 to 4 in the last election. I think people have looked at your performance in Parliament and what you've achieved for both the party and the country. So, and thank you so much for giving us your time, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. All right. All the very best.
All the best now. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.